Thank you for joining us today for Digging for Truth. The question, who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, has plagued scholars and laymen and even Hollywood types for centuries. To help us explore the subject and answer the question, Dr. Douglas Petrovich joins us again from the Bible Seminary in Texas. We'll be continuing our talk about the Exodus Pharaoh. Doug, welcome back to Digging for Truth.
Thank you, Henry. It's great to be back with you.
Hey, it's great to have you back. We want to just refer our audience who might have missed part one back to part one, where Doug lays out a great case here from the biblical text and from some of the evidence regarding Amenhotep II. I would like you to give them a quick synopsis, Doug, if you would, of what we talked about so far, and then we'll launch into a new area that we haven't covered yet.
Sure, Henry. So Amenhotep II is the Egyptian pharaoh or king that I and many others are recognizing as the only historically legitimate king that can be connected to this figure we know of as the Exodus pharaoh in the Bible. And he reigned during Dynasty 18, which would be the 15th century BC. So we hold what's called the early Exodus view rather than the late Exodus view that suggests that the Exodus pharaoh lived in the 13th century BC in the Ramesside period. So that being the case, his predecessor, Thutmose III, his father, had an extremely long reign. And of course, we pointed out in the last episode that it had to be over 40 years. And sure enough, there are only two pharaohs in the entire 18th and 19th dynasties combined who fit that bill, who ruled over 40 years. One of them is Ramses II, who's oftentimes, with the late Exodus view, given credit as being the Exodus pharaoh himself. But it says that the Bible says that it's the predecessor of the Exodus pharaoh who reigns over 40 years. So it doesn't work at all to make Ramses II the king. But Amenhotep II works perfectly because his father, Thutmose III, ruled into year 54 of his reign. So this is the time period that all of the sources point us to, and a right synchronization between Egyptian chronology and biblical chronology point us to. And so now we've identified Amenhotep II as the pharaoh of the Exodus, and we can look into his biography to see how all of this kind of works together between biblical history and ancient Egyptian history.
Oh, that's an excellent summation, and we encourage folks to go back and watch that first episode if they want to find out more. Now, one of the things that you point to is the biography of Amenhotep II and this military campaign that he launches later of the same year as the Exodus. And I won't say any more because I want you to share with the audience what you know about this.
Sure. And this was an amazing set of like gold mines, like falling into gold mines, right? When I researched all of this and I realized how it fits so perfectly together with biblical history. So Amenhotep II launched two campaigns into Asia. We call these Asiatic campaigns. The first one was when his father died and the kings of the Levant rebelled against Egypt's authority because his father, Thutmose III, had them, under his thumb. So they rebelled. He went up into Canaan and all the way up into Syria, all the way to the border of Mitanni, his ancient rival, his superpower rival. And he fought back and he regained control of all of these city-states. And in these 17 campaigns that his father, that Amenhotep II's father, launched, Thutmose III, into the Levant, they always were gaining more territory. But Amenhotep II's second and final Asiatic campaign, in his year 7, which I'm equating to 1446 BC, it did not go further into the Levant. It did not go all the way up into Syria or all the way to the Euphrates River like his father did. Instead, it's what we would call a glorified slave raid. And what does that mean? It means that if you look at the numbers recorded there, the booty list, what did he walk away from with this campaign? If you add up the numbers, it's over 100,000 slaves that he acquired. And what does that mean? Well, let's contrast it to the other campaigns of his first campaign, and then 3 of the campaigns that his father launched that give us a number. 46 times more slaves were taken by Amenhotep II in his second Asiatic campaign than all of those other recorded campaigns combined. That's staggering. Plus, this campaign was launched in November. This isn't the season that you launch a campaign if you're an ancient king. You launch your campaigns in the spring. It says in 1 Chronicles 20, then it happened in the spring, at the time when kings go out to battle, that Joab led out the army and ravaged the land of the sons of Ammon, etc. So that's when battles take place. And that's true within all of the ancient world and all of the history that's been left behind. But this was a campaign in November, in the winter. Why would you launch it in November? Well, if you've just lost your slave base in April of that same year, you would be looking for slaves. And Henry, if you look at the numbers out of that 100,000 plus total of slaves that were taken in southern Canaan, in Canaan actually, in the southern Levant, 3,600 of them are called Habiru. This is the first mention of Habiru prisoners taken by Egyptians in all of Egypt's history. Again, if this is months after the Exodus and some number of the Israelites have left the base, right? Like we have Korah's rebellion and this attacks on Moses' leadership. Now you have Israelites very prone to walk away from Moses and to walk away from the body of the Israelites, wanting to have something for themselves. So we would think from history that they found their way. They separated from Moses. They found their way into Canaan. They settled down. And next thing you know, in November of that year, Pharaoh comes along and he sweeps up everyone he can to be his slaves to take them down to Egypt. So this is some of the connection that you can see between his second Asiatic campaign and what we would expect to happen after this devastating time period in Egypt's history after the 10th plague and his army dies in the Sea of Reeds.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary, and you've laid this out from the evidence, and you're not saying anything that's not already in the academic material. It's there. This is what Amenhotep did. He captured 46 times as many slaves as his predecessor, his father, and himself. Yep. Right? Yep. Is that correct?
That's right. 46 times more slaves.
Yeah, it's one of those logical things. It's like they lose all the slaves. He's going at the wrong time. And then what I'd like in the next segment, Doug, is for you to share with the audience what the Habiru are, because there's a fascinating possible connection, you make the argument, with the Israelites. And friends, thank you for joining us for Digging for Truth. We're talking about the Pharaoh of the Exodus with Doug Petrovich, and we'll be right back.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm here with Dr. Douglas Petrovich, who's an expert in Egyptology and archaeology, and he's here sharing with us his arguments for Amenhotep II as the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Now, Doug, you mentioned this group of 3,600 Habiru that were captured by Amenhotep II in the fall campaign after the Exodus. Tell the audience what you see this connection with the Israelites and how that works in your thinking based on the evidence and the arguments, please.
Sure, and it all goes back to the statement that's made by Moses in the Scripture when Abram is first introduced, and it says that Abram is a Hebrew, and that's fascinating because you think about the Hebrews and you think, well, don't the Hebrews start with Jacob and it's everybody in Jacob's family after that, and those are the Hebrews? But no, it says that Abram, who became Abraham, himself was a Hebrew. And so there's a term that's used in Akkadian, it's Habiru, and that translates into Middle Egyptian as Apiru. And it's the same word. No scholar disagrees that it's the same word. It's these ancient peoples who descend from somebody, and it's connected to this term Habiru. Well, it also says in the genealogy that's in Genesis, which you love so well, that that the forefather of Abram is a guy named Aber. And Aber has all of the right consonants to fit this same term. So who was Abram? Abram was an Abarite. That's who he was. So from Aber descended numbers of peoples. And only one of that group of peoples found its way to a man named Abram. And so he was one of many Heberites or Eberites, however you want to term it. And so these people are found throughout the ancient world. In Mesopotamia, they're found in the 1700s BC, and they're not part of Abraham's family, but they're fellow Heberites. They're his relatives.
Yes.
So it's no surprise that Apiru are, part of these descendants who show up and are involved in what's going on in Egypt. And Henry, if you look at the Amarna letters that are composed by scribes under Akhenaten in the 14th century BC, right? And this is before the late Exodus view and its time frame for the Exodus in the 13th century BC. So there are discussions that go on between the Pharaoh and the kings that are in these city-states in Canaan. And the city-states in Canaan are complaining because these people called the Habiru are attacking them over and over and over again. And the greatest king of all of the petty kings of Canaan, the only one who's actually called a king in the Amarna tablets other than Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, is the king of Hatzor, where you and I were digging in 2007. And that king was so powerful, he was called by his fellow Canaanite kings a true king. And what it says in the Amarna letters, as you walk through them, the ones that deal with Hatzor, it says that the allegiance of the king of Hatzor first was with the king of Egypt, and then over time, his allegiance moved toward these Habiru who kept attacking him. And think about this, Henry. Think about the logic. How would the greatest king of Canaan, who has the Egyptian king to rely on if he needs him, how would that king give himself over to the power of these Habiru if they're only what scholars today call marauders? They're bandits. That's what scholars are telling us,
yes.
That the Habiru are bandits. That just can't be the case. Why? Because 3,600 of them were captured by the king of Egypt in one place and brought back as slaves. What king would capture 3,600 thieves? That would be stupid. Number two, when in history do you ever have 3,600 thieves assembling themselves together and working as a close-knit unit? It does not happen.
Yeah, there's a lot of logic to that argument, and I'll tell you, I think that needs to be taken much more seriously. And of course, the liberal scholars, critical scholars, they dismiss the Exodus, so they try to break this connection that you're making there. But I think there's a lot to be said for it. I wish we could talk about it more, Doug, but we do need to move to our next sort of identifying piece of information. We're going to shift back a little bit and talk about Moses when he was a baby. He was put into the Nile River by the Pharaoh's daughter. And it's fascinating. Let's talk about her.
Sure. And the question comes, well, what's the name of this princess who was involved? Well, there's a queen, there's a woman who became a princess who became a queen who became a king called Hatshepsut. She was the daughter of Thutmose I. And we already established in our first show, your first show with me, that it was Thutmose I who is the king who initiated that edict, that decree that said all of the male children of the Hebrews were to be killed. So that being the case, Hatshepsut is one of his daughters. In fact, she's the only daughter of his through Queen Amosa, the main queen of Thutmose III. She's the only daughter who survives infancy, which is fascinating, especially because that oldest, that princess, she almost certainly had to had enough mental faculties to be able to give instructions when that reed basket was found. So you have to be old enough to be, a princess of age to be able to understand these things and communicate to people so that things are happening like we read about in the biblical text. So Thutmose I had one other secondary wife, Mutnofret. But Mutnofret, as far as we know, she never bore a daughter, or if she did, that daughter is never attested in any kind of documents or records. So we have no reason to think that there's any legitimate chance that a daughter of hers, the secondary queen, would be the right candidate. So almost certainly Hatshepsut fits that bill perfectly.
That's very good. Now, for our audience, in terms of remembering who was the Pharaoh's daughter, we think it was, I learned this when I went to Egypt in 2005, Doug. It's Hatshepsut. You say, so Hatshepsut, you say Hatshepsut, I say Hatshepsut. But either way, this is a good way to remember the name. Now, in our next segment, Doug, we want to talk a little bit about a desecration campaign that occurs against her. Now, you have about 30 seconds to explain to the audience what that is real quick, and then we'll talk about it in the next segment.
Okay, so there was a campaign that was waged to destroy every image of Hatshepsut and every written form that expresses her name in a cartouche, right? So, and that's important because for every person to live forever in the field of reeds, the body, image, or name of that person must survive on earth. So someone, Henry, had a really important reason to try to wipe her out from all history on earth.
Well, we're going to talk about that in just a few moments. Friends, we're here with Dr. Douglas Petrovich. He's talking to us about the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and we'll be right back.
Bible in Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible in Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Digging for Truth is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV, positively different television.
Welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your host, Henry Smith. I'm here with Doug Petrovich. We're talking about the Pharaoh of the Exodus, Amenhotep II. Now, Doug, we left off talking about the Pharaoh, the daughters of the Pharaoh who took Moses out of the water, and you were talking about this campaign to erase her name from Egyptian history. Let's develop that a little bit more. Explain some of the theology and some of the evidence connected to that. It's really fascinating.
Sure. I mean, basically, if you look around ancient Egypt, and you can Google and find images of Hatshepsut where it shows that her face is carved out, her body is carved out, her name is carved out of cartouches. In some cases, other kings' names are put in place where her name was. So there was this amazing nationwide activity. This had to be instructed by the king, no doubt about it, to wipe out every image of Hatshepsut. And she, of course, was the co-ruler with Thutmose III in the early part of his reign. He was a boy, and so she was old enough to kind of run the country as an adoptive mother. And then he took over sole rule at a later time. But her image, it didn't start to be destroyed or desecrated in Egypt until, and we know this from the evidence, until 20 years after Thutmose III was the sole ruler of Egypt. So for the Egyptologists who say probably Thutmose III kind of felt this all of a sudden, after the fact, he was angry that there was a woman on the throne and he needed to, right the wrong. Then why did he wait 20 years to do this, right? So it doesn't make sense. Plus, all of the building projects that Hatshepsut began, he completed. And that's not what you do with somebody that you hate. You would never do that. You would maybe destroy them, or you would maybe rebuild them in your name. That's not what happened. So anyway, this desecration happened, and here's the problem. If all memory of an individual were lost or destroyed, the spirit of that person, and we have an Egyptian word for that, it's the Ka, it's the immaterial person. That immaterial person would also perish, initiating this much dreaded second death, which is a total obliteration from all that there, and there's no return from this. So if that's the case, who would want to obliterate her? Well, Thutmose III, again, makes no sense. But Amenhotep II Henry, he makes great sense. Why? Because after he lost his army in the Sea of Reeds, imagine this, he comes back to Egypt, and how is he feeling? He lost his son, not just a son, his oldest son, who was going to be next on the throne. Every Egyptian family member and friend and citizen lost his or her firstborn, and all of their cattle and all of their other herds, they all lost their firstborn. And there are these dead people and dead animals all over Egypt. He lost his army, and he who was the world leader, right? He was the leader of the superpower government on the earth, the greater empire between them and Mitanni. What would he feel like? He would be devastated. So he issued this decree to have her image desecrated throughout Egypt, because he knew that she was the Egyptian adoptive mother of Moses, and without her, Moses never would have gone on to be the one to take the Israelites out of Egypt. Isn't that fascinating?
It is. It's beyond fascinating. It's one of the most fascinating parts of the subject. It takes a little bit of inference to connect it up, but there really isn't a lot of other explanation. And you think about the rage Amenhotep II would have felt. If this foolish woman hadn't plucked this baby out of the river, we wouldn't have been in this disaster that we're in. Well, I'd like to talk about that more, but we want to talk about one more piece of evidence, and that is, you've mentioned the Royal Navy port of Avaris, and you did an extensive research paper on this. Of course, we can't develop it, but I want to talk about the timing of its abandonment, because according to the archaeology, it's suddenly abandoned. Well, when did that happen? And give us a little taste of the evidence for that.
Sure, Henry. And this goes back to the article that I published in an Egyptological journal with no biblical references whatsoever, to make sure that it wouldn't be, blocked out by peer review for mentioning the Bible. I made a case for the abandonment of Avaris during the reign of Amenhotep II. And it goes back to this mass number of burials of animals and people at Avaris during Amenhotep II's reign. And as far as the animals, there are 4 animals mentioned in the Bible at the time of the Passover: sheep, goats, cattle, and dogs. And sure enough, what did the archaeologists find? In the palatial district, that is where the 3 palaces were at Avaris, in that district where you'd never expect animals, there were burials, mass burials of those 4 animals. Sheep and goats the most, and the most of the sheep and goats, they were in their first year of age when they died. One died from a blow to the back of the head, and there was another death between a mother and mother and her ewe that died during childbirth. So these amazing deaths of these animals, and you have these mass burials of these animals, all of it is connected to the time of Amenhotep II. How do we know this? The very little pottery evidence that's found in those burials, and Henry, you know how important pottery evidence is. It can date something, yes, relatively speaking. That pottery is pottery that's indicative of pottery of 2 kings, Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. That being the case, usually you date it to the later of the 2. So that would be Amenhotep II. So pottery from his reign is found in those graves of these animals that are buried, the majority of which are sheep and goats, and the majority of which of those are killed or die in their first year of age. So that abandonment, I would connect, Henry, to the time of this debacle in the Sea of Reeds, when the Pharaoh has lost his army. He comes back to Egypt, and he's decimated, and they pretty much clean things up at Avaris and probably just leave that site and kind of consider it ritually impure. And what we know is this: when Amenhotep II came back from Canaan in his first victorious campaign, it says that the first site he went to is Peru Nefer. That's Avaris. But in the second campaign, it doesn't say that he first stopped at Peru Nefer. He went to Memphis. So he skipped that stop, that normal place of stopping when a king brings his army back into Egypt. Why? Because it was abandoned. There was nobody there in year 7 in 1446. In November, the year of the Exodus, which occurred in April of that year.
That is phenomenal, Doug. Well, I hate to say it, but we've run out of time, my friend. Thank you for your fidelity and faithfulness to the Bible and your academic excellence and your expertise in all this. We're so grateful you came on the show to share this with the audience. Thank you so much, Doug.
It was my pleasure, Henry. Thank you.
We're grateful to have you. And friends, as you can see, we did a tour de force of evidence related to Amenhotep II as Pharaoh of the Exodus. Dr. Petrovich deserves a lot of credit for the hard work that he's done. We thank God for him, and we thank God for you for watching Digger for Truth, and we hope you've been lifted up today. Thank you for watching.